This is messianic. This is utopian. Investing the blood of our sons and treasure of our nation in pursuit of this vision will bleed, bankrupt, and break this republic in endless crusades and interminable wars. Unless this ideology is purged from power, it will bring an end to the republic. No nation, no matter how great, powerful, or rich, can sustain so apocalyptic and global a struggle. Pat Buchanan. Over the course of recent weeks, implications of a resurging conflict in the Middle East have been supplemental, with diplomacy between the United States and Iran over a nuclear deal involving uranium enrichment appearing to be a utopian fantasy after 7 weeks of blunt negotiations. To make matters even more lamentable, Israel has conveyed to the US that a strike on Iranian nuclear facilities amid the apparent failed diplomacy talks between the US and Iran could lead to strikes against Iran, which, fast forward to the making of this video, has happened, making a war in the Middle East almost inevitable. While war may be unavoidable, it is pivotal that the United States stays out of the potential conflict if escalations were to deteriorate even further. For far too long, America has had the ambition to over-imperialize and to constantly engage in foreign intervention to fight for what is right and to spread democracy to the whole world. But this is not what our founding fathers intended for us, and they knew of the cataclysmic effects that it would cause us. No nation can preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare, James Madison said. The Constitution itself is very perspicuous that the men who take arms for this country do not take an oath to safeguard the nations of the world in the name of peace and progress. They take an oath to defend this great country that we hold dear to us. Numerous great empires have fallen due to overexpanding their empires, and it seems that America will face the same fate. Because interventionism is an apparatus for terrorism within a state. As we behave like the world's peacemakers, the ones who get the short hand of the stick come here and commit treacherous attacks on our own people out of anger for the same treachery we have caused towards their own people. This was the case with September 11th. Upon the painstaking process of lamenting upon what occurred on that day, it was quickly discovered that the two major perpetrators of the attack, both Osama bin Laden and Sheikh Khalid Mohammed, both priorly professed a hatred towards America, with Osama bin Laden notoriously declaring a state of jihad on America in a 1997 CNN interview. Because of America meddling in Middle Eastern affairs and supporting the Israeli state that was massacring Palestinians as well as unlawfully building settlements in the West Bank. We declare jihad against the US government because the US government is unjust, criminal, and tyrannical. It has committed acts that are extremely unjust, hideous, and criminal, whether directly or through its support of the Israeli occupation of the land of the Prophet's night journey, referring to Palestine. And we believe the US is directly responsible for those who were killed in Palestine, Lebanon, and Iraq, Osama bin Laden declared in the 1997 CNN interview. However, our intervention and support of Israeli brutalities in the Middle East are not just on the minds of renowned terrorists, but rather a majority of the citizens of Arab countries. A recent report on the Arab public opinion about Israel's war on Gaza by the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., shows that favorability towards U.S. foreign policy is facing the same blows it once faced after the 2003 invasion of Iraq. When asked about the responses of regional and international powers to Israel's war on Gaza, a near consensus of 94% considered the U.S. position to be bad, with 82% considering it to be very bad, the report claimed. With such monumental unfavorability, what makes the assertion that America could face another calamitous attack on its soil so unlikely? After all, in recent weeks, we have seen 2 terror attacks targeted at Israelis in the U.S., with 2 Israeli diplomats being shot by a pro-Palestinian activist, as well as an Arab American by the name of Muhammad Sabri Solomons throwing Molotovs at pro-Israeli protests in Colorado. What becomes shockingly more apparent and conspicuous is how matters of terrorism on American soil in the name of protest against the Israeli government end up conveniently benefiting Israel. Israeli prime ministers themselves have ventured into getting the United States to join them in the war on terrorism on multiple occasions post 9/11. You and America are in a war against terror. We in Israel are in a war against terror. It's the same war, Ariel Sharon said right after 9/11. If we do not immediately shut down the terror factories where Arafat is producing human bombs, it is only a matter of time before suicide bombers will terrorize your cities. If not destroyed, this madness will strike you in your buses, in your supermarkets, in your pizza parlors, in your cafes, Netanyahu declared in 2002. What is even more shocking is that a small group of Americans, rather than Israelis, help us understand this, with these same Americans devising a plan for a roadmap to total Israeli hegemony in the Middle East. Alas, the conversation must briefly be turned to the neoconservatives. With the end of the Cold War, what we really need is an obvious ideological and threatening enemy, one worth our mettle, one that could unite us in opposition, Irving Kristol, the godfather of neoconservatism, said in 1996. This is what the founder of the neoconservative movement stated just 5 years before 9/11. Before breaking into how the neoconservatives infiltrated the George W. Bush administration, bonded with Netanyahu, and used the tragedy of 9/11 to help Israel expand its hegemony in the Middle East, it is worth breaking into the history of the neoconservatives. The neoconservatives were formal liberals who supported Leon Trotsky, socialism, and Democrat presidents such as Lyndon Baines Johnson and Harry Truman. However, both during the 1972 election period between McGovern and Nixon and during the Yom Kippur War of 1973, these liberals who were in continuous support of war left the Democrat Party after McGovern campaigned on non-interventionism and solidified their shift to the Republican Party when Nixon reassured support for Israel during its conflict in 1973. It is paramount to understand that, unlike conventional conservatives, neoconservatives are not driven by culture and patriotism, but rather an ideology, particularly democracy. Barring extraordinary events, the United States will always feel obliged to defend, if possible, a democratic nation under attack from non-democratic forces, external or internal. This is why it was in our national interest to come to the defense of France and Britain in World War II. That is why we feel necessary to defend Israel today, when its survival is threatened. No complicated geopolitical calculations of natural interest are necessary, Irving Kristol stated in his essay, The Neoconservative Persuasion. Now, this statement is already fallacious based on the reason that America has sided with many dictators, being Joseph Stalin, Saddam Hussein, and many more, during several conflicts across the globe. But this quotation is brought to the table to demonstrate the use of the ideology of spreading democracy as a means to cover up the genuine intention of the neoconservative to support the interests of Israel. This now takes us to the consequent theme for Israeli hegemony in the Middle East designed by the neoconservatives, the Clean Break Memo. The Clean Break Memo was a report written by neoconservatives like Richard Peril, Douglas Feith, and David Wurmser. In this report, clear targets for Israel's hegemony in the Middle East were listed in the memo as well as how to deteriorate all of them. Saddam Hussein's Iraq was one of the main targets in the report that was deemed a threat to Israel. Decades prior to the invasion of Iraq, neoconservatives set out to make Bill Clinton declare that the overthrow of Saddam's regime was of the utmost importance in his State of the Union address, with names along the lines of William Crystal, Richard Peril, Paul Wolfowitz, and Donald Rumsfeld signing the letter asking Bill Clinton to make the contentious claim publicly. The urgency from the neoconservatives to push for a war with Iraq was always there. They just needed a pretext for it to come to full fruition. They actually knew this truth a little too well, with David Wurmser stating the urgency to wait for opportunities to launch preemptive strikes in a U.S.-Israeli joint war plan published on January 1st, 2001, being published just 9 months before 9/11. The day after 9/11, in an interview on CNN, Bill Bennett stated that Congress must declare war on militant Islam and cited Lebanon, Libya, Syria, Iraq, and China, with all nations besides China being considered threats to Israeli hegemony in the Clean Break memo as targets that should be attacked. Note that Afghanistan, where Osama's terrorists actually came from, was not mentioned in his address at all. How is it that just after a day of the attack, Bennett knew of 6 perpetrators, yet did not mention the only true perpetrator? Fast forward to today. After the neoconservatives won over George W. Bush to carry out the invasion of Iraq, Libya has been overthrown, Hezbollah and Lebanon have practically been annihilated, Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria was overthrown by rebels within Syria, and we stand here right now talking about how we must stop Israel to start a war with Iran. This potential war that Israel is trying to get us into is a lot different than the other predestined targets that we helped them overthrow. Unlike Gaddafi's Libya and Saddam's Iraq, what we are dealing with here is a superpower that has the capability, or for all we know, already is going nuclear in Iran. After 6 rounds of stagnant negotiations between the US and Iran over a nuclear deal, both sides have made it apparent that a deal will not be reached. Iran has even gone as far as threatening US facilities in areas like Iraq, being the reason why we have pulled out our troops from these areas very recently. However, as we have displayed, it is unfair to claim that Iran is the aggressor when Israel has repeatedly used this same rhetoric with the regimes of other nations that we have overthrown on their behalf, as we have seen with the Clean Break memo. It must also be noted that Netanyahu was pushing for a strike on Iranian nuclear facilities during the negotiations for diplomacy between the US and Iran. In the event Iran is taken down and undergoes regime change, nobody in the Middle East could stop Israel from expanding as well as expelling the Palestinians from their homeland. Therefore, can we really say the Iranians are the aggressors compared to Israel? For far too long, Israel has dragged us into their wars for their benefit, while they have never come to the aid in the wars that we were involved in, with the 2 Gulf Wars being prime examples of this. What we could be facing is even more dire than other wars that we supported Israel in with aid or even intervention, such as the Yom Kippur War and the war in Iraq. What we are talking about could spark a nuclear global conflict. Yet, Netanyahu does not seem to care, as the only interest in his mind is the interest of expanding Israel's Middle Eastern hegemony. Such a liability must face penalization. In 1956, during the Suez Crisis, the US threatened Israel with the withdrawal of foreign aid if they did not end their invasion of the Sinai with Britain and France. It ended up working. The US seems to have forgotten that without them, the Israeli state would not exist. We played a pivotal role in the establishment of Israel in 1948. Yet, we are behaving like they own us with how much bidding has been done in their favor on our end. To prevent a potential world war from breaking out, President Donald Trump has to play the same card Dwight D. Eisenhower did in 1956. Threatened to cut aid to Israel. Though AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, will most definitely convince our congressmen and congresswomen to oppose such an imposition on Israel, as they did when Gerald Ford and Henry Kissinger threatened to pull aid from Israel after their obstinance during the negotiations with Egypt in 1975. We live in a completely different age. We have access to who is a member of the AIPAC lobby and who would be a recipient of their aid if AIPAC attempts to stop a blockade of foreign aid to Israel or to get members of Congress to agree to enter a war with Iran. Rallied together, both left and right, we could not only protest against the president for entertaining a war with Iran, but also every member of Congress who votes in favor of it. The solution is to make the mere idea of entering a war with Iran a political catastrophe. On the brink of a potential world war, the left and right must temporarily set aside their differences and rally behind this cause to not only protect the United States, but to protect the entirety of the world.